The gates are closed. The bar drops across them with a sound like a coffin lid. And from this moment, whether you live or die depends on how much food is sitting in the cellar beneath your feet. That's the reality of a medieval siege. Not a battle, not a charge, not swords clashing in an open field. A siege was slower than that, and in almost every way crueler. It was an army camped outside your walls with one simple goal: starve you, sicken you, and break your mind before they ever had to break your gate. And if you were unlucky enough to be inside when it happened, you were about to live through one of the worst experiences a human being could survive. It starts before the enemy even arrives. Smart lords knew a siege was coming long before the first soldier appeared on the horizon, so castles and fortified towns spent years preparing for it as a matter of survival, not choice. Barrels of salted beef and pork lined the cellars. Wheels of hard cheese were sealed in wax to keep for months. Sacks of wheat, rye, and barley were stacked to the ceiling, because grain was the one thing that could be milled into flour or boiled into porridge and stretched the longest. Salisbury Castle stores in 1173 read almost like a shopping list for the apocalypse. Corn, wheat, bacon, cheese, beans, salt, malt. Animals weren't kept alive if it could be helped, because a living cow eats food that a human could be eating instead. And nobody drank the water if they didn't have to. Water spoiled, water carried disease, so weak beer and wine were the drink of choice. Not because anyone wanted to get drunk, but because brewing and fermenting killed the things that could kill you. A castle's most valuable asset wasn't its walls, it was its well. If the enemy could poison it, cut it off, or dry it up, the fight was already over. Which is why the best-built fortresses drilled straight through bedrock to guarantee water no army outside could touch. Then the enemy shows up, and everything changes overnight. Word spreads through the countryside, and every farmer, every villager, every family living outside the walls runs for the gates, dragging carts, livestock, whatever they can carry. A castle built to comfortably hold a few hundred people suddenly has to swallow thousands. And here's the brutal math nobody wants to say out loud. Every one of those extra mouths is eating rations that were never meant for them. Commanders called the old, the sick, and the very young useless mouths, and when the math stopped working, those were the people pushed back out the gates. At Chateau Gaillard in 1203, the constable Roger de Lacy let the townspeople in when the French army arrived. When the stores started running thin, he forced the weakest and oldest back outside the walls. The French besiegers let them pass through the lines at first. Then they simply stopped. Hundreds of people were trapped in the ditch between the walls and the enemy camp, and chroniclers wrote about infants trying to nurse from mothers who had already died of hunger. This wasn't a one-time horror. It happened at Calais. It happened at Rouen. It happened again and again, because starvation forces choices no army once remembered. For the people who stayed inside, life shrank into something almost unrecognizable. Every hall, tower, and courtyard filled with bodies. Privacy disappeared completely. The stone walls held the cold in like a tomb, and firewood was rationed just as tightly as food, so people slept shivering under whatever they had. The latrines built into the walls backed up under the weight of thousands of extra people using them, and waste piled up faster than anyone could clear it. Straw on the floors soaked up the filth, and in doing so, became a breeding ground for lice, fleas, and rats. Bathing stopped being a possibility within days. Clothes went unwashed for months. If you'd walked through those halls, the smell alone would have told you everything you needed to know about how bad it had gotten. In the beginning though, spirits were actually high. There's a strange rush that comes with a siege's opening days, something like adrenaline mixed with solidarity. Everyone convinced relief is just over the horizon. Men worked the walls in shifts, repairing damage from bombardment, launching sorties out into the enemy camp to steal cattle or burn siege engines before retreating back inside. Women managed what was left of the cooking, tended the wounded, and threw water or sand on anything the enemy launched over the walls that was burning. Children fetched water and ran messages between posts, small enough to slip through crowded halls faster than anyone else. For a little while, some nobility even kept up appearances. Games, storytelling, small distractions to keep morale from collapsing. But that never lasted. As weeks stretched into months with no sign of rescue, the mood curdled into something darker. Depression set in. Rationing had to be enforced by force because private baking or secret slaughter meant someone was hoarding food that belonged to everyone. Markets emptied out entirely. Coin became worthless. Food became the only currency that mattered, and people who hoarded it were treated like criminals, because in every sense that counted, they were. And then came the part that chroniclers describe with almost clinical detail, because it happened the same way, siege after siege, century after century. The food ran out, in order, like a countdown nobody could stop. Fresh meat went first, because live animals needed feed that was already scarce, so slaughtering them made more sense than starving them slowly alongside the humans. Horses went next, and that decision alone tells you how desperate things had gotten, because a horse war was one of the most valuable things a knight could own. After the horses came the dogs, then the cats, then whatever rats and mice could be caught, and by that point they weren't vermin anymore, they were dinner. And dinner had a price tag attached. At Rouen in 1418, under siege by Henry V, records describe a single mouse selling for 6 pence and rats going for even more. At Calais, the commander Jean de Vienne wrote directly to the King of France admitting his people had already eaten their horses, their dogs, their rats, and were staring down the possibility of eating each other next. Leather didn't escape either. Harnesses, belts, even shoes were boiled for hours until they softened into something a starving person could force down and barely digest. After that, there was nothing left but grass pulled from between courtyard stones, bark stripped from anything wooden, moss scraped off the walls. In the very worst cases, people boiled parchment, scraping the ink off first just to have something, anything, moving through their stomachs. During the First Crusade siege of Antioch, starving crusaders were documented eating donkey meat, thistles, and leaves, with some accounts describing cannibalism among the most desperate. This wasn't an exaggeration written for shock value. It was the literal sequential collapse of a food supply, recorded independently at siege after siege with almost identical details, because starvation follows the same brutal script no matter where it happens. But food wasn't even the biggest killer, water was. Wells inside the walls sat surrounded by garder-robes, courtyards, and eventually corpses, and with thousands of extra people crammed inside, that contamination spread fast. Dysentery, what people at the time simply called the bloody flux, tore through overcrowded fortresses faster than any weapon the enemy owned. Symptoms could appear within hours of drinking bad water. Death from dehydration could follow within days. Typhus spread through lice living in unwashed hair and clothing, thriving in exactly the filthy, crowded conditions a siege guaranteed. Scurvy crept in from the total absence of anything fresh. And because the living were often too weak to bury the dead properly, corpses piled up, making everything worse in a vicious cycle that had no real solution with the medicine of the time, which amounted to little more than bleeding and prayer. In one of the darkest documented moments of medieval siege warfare, at Katha in 1346, the besieging Mongol army is said to have catapulted plague-infected corpses over the walls, specifically to spread disease inside, a chilling early example of biological warfare, whether or not it was the actual trigger for the plague outbreak that followed, as some modern historians debate. Fear never let up either. There was the fear of a full assault, ladders and towers slamming against the walls in the dead of night. There was the fear of mining, enemy sappers tunneling silently underneath the fortress to collapse it from below, countered by desperate men digging counter tunnels to fight underground in total darkness. There was a psychological terror of watching the enemy launch severed heads of captured messengers over the walls, a message that needed no translation. And there was the quiet, grinding fear that comes from watching your own body fail you while you're still expected to fight. Chroniclers wrote about knights, men whose entire identity was built on physical strength, reduced to crawling because they no longer had the strength to stand. Eventually, every siege reached its breaking point, one way or another. Sometimes it ended in a negotiated surrender, and if a garrison hadn't held out too long by the standards of the day, they could march out with their weapons and dignity intact, a practice known as marching out with the honors of war. But holding out too long carried its own price. At Bedford Castle in 1224, after 8 brutal weeks and the collapse of the keep from enemy mining, the senior defenders were hanged the moment the castle fell, a grim reminder that defiance had a shelf life. At Calais, after nearly a year of starvation under Edward III, 6 of the city's most prominent citizens famously offered their own lives to the English king in exchange for sparing the rest of the population, an act of sacrifice later immortalized in stone by the sculptor Rodin. At Stirling Castle in 1304, a garrison of just 30 Scottish soldiers held out against the full might of Edward I of England and his enormous siege engine nicknamed the Warwolf, a machine so massive it reportedly took months just to build. For whoever walked out alive, and plenty didn't, survival didn't feel like victory. It felt like the barest edge of it. Survivors emerged emaciated, disease-ridden, and psychologically altered in ways that could take years to unwind, if they ever fully did. Cities took years, sometimes decades, to rebuild their population and their walls. And here's the detail that historians keep coming back to. In almost every prolonged siege on record, starvation and disease killed far more people than swords, arrows, or fire ever did. Chronicles from Froissart to Jean Lebel to the eyewitness accounts of the Crusades all describe the same grim sequence over and over across centuries and across an entire continent. Stockpile, isolate, starve, sicken, break. Survival came down to less heroism than we like to imagine and more to something colder. How full the cellar was, how deep the well ran, whether the weakest were pushed outside in time, and whether help arrived before the walls and the people inside them finally gave out. If you like this video, subscribe for more like it, and drop a comment with what siege or historical survival story you want covered next.